A lot of people seem to think that the average DD you can encounter in random dungeons is extremely bad at the game, which is why a lot of tanks avoid the dungeon finder like fire, and only play with people they already know. So over the past 2 months, I've queued into 65 random veteran dungeons as a tank, and kept track of the DPS and various other statistics about my teammates in a spreadsheet, to try and gauge the average DPS of an average player you could encounter in your dungeons. Other than their DPS, I also kept track of their base class, which I think in the current state of the game is mostly a pointless information, so I didn't end up drawing any conclusions from this one. Whether they wear a heavy leg build, whether they use the Oakensoul mythic, whether they wear a One Bar build, whether they wear a beam build, which means using the Herald of the Tome skill line and using the Fate Carver skill, whether they had the Hodor add-on enabled. It's an add-on which allows you to share your DPS number with teammates in real time, and whether they responded to me saying hi at the beginning of the dungeon. There is also a column called Notes where I wrote down some very specific stuff, if they were doing some really weird shit, like for example, constantly killing their one-bar pet and resummoning it over and over, or using a build which uses beam without having any way to generate cracks, or simply using some build from one of the popular grifter build creators and then trolling everyone around them by using Prayer Shawl on a DPS build. As for the testing method, I checked people's DPS across the entire dungeon, which includes trash packs, but in order to not punish people in dungeons which have a lot of roleplay, when you have nothing to hit, I've been checking only DPS while active. There will be some tiny differences between dungeons. DPS in dungeons with more trash will appear higher, but there's no way to make this information any more accurate unless I limit myself to running only a single dungeon, which would destroy my sanity. In all of those runs, I am the tank. Since my initial expectation of this project was that I'm going to prove how awful the average DPS is, I wanted to make sure these DDs get the absolute best tanking possible, to make sure my argument is irrefutable. So in all of these runs, I use my dungeon subclass build. So the DPS from the spreadsheet is the DPS people do while having all the most important buffs, debuffs, and positioning handed to them. So the average DPS across the board was 43,537. While this is quite far from what's possible, I don't think it's a low number. If you get 2 DDs pulling these numbers, you will have a smooth run. Before I started the experiment, I expected a way lower number. If you look at the difference between heavy attack and non-heavy attack builds, the average heavy attacker did 36,176 DPS, while non-heavy attackers, specifically, did 44,821. So non-heavy attack builds performed roughly 24% better. Which is surprising to me because I expected the ease of play of heavy attack builds to play a bigger part here. The ceiling of regular builds is 177k DPS, or 171k without the impractical Huntsman mythic. And the ceiling of heavy attack builds is 144k. So at the very top, non-heavy attack builds are roughly 90% better than heavy attack builds. My expectation was that this 90% difference would be even smaller here, because you're playing with random players who will have varying levels of skill, and heavy attack builds are extremely easy to play. But this didn't happen. The difference actually went up to 24%, and the culprits are Oakensoul and internet misinformation. Heavy attack builds are meant to be simple and accessible, making them popular among more casual players. Unfortunately, most of the online discussion around them is dominated by anti-intellectual grifters who don't do proper testing, and their build videos don't include parsers or logs or any kind of testing. As a result, they keep spreading bad advice, like recommending Oakensoul on setups where it clearly doesn't belong. Oakensoul being so popular on heavy attack builds is an extremely weird phenomenon, because these two things not only don't synergize with each other, they have anti-synergy. Heavy attack builds have to use Sergeant's Mail, which is a heavy armor set, and with Oakensoul, you're forced to use one heavy armor piece, if you want to use it in combination with Sergeant. Even if you exclude the new Rakat's Voidmantle mythic, Oakensoul gets outperformed on one-bar heavy attack builds, even by monster sets, such as Antilmer's Construct, Dummy House, or Maw of Infernal. So, back to the dungeon testing, most of the heavy attack users in my dungeons were Oakensoul users, which is the cause of the lower number. The number looks much better when you look at a proper build using Rakat's Voidmantle, which can reach even 65k through the entire dungeon. Next, let's have a look at Oakensoul and One Bar. I wanted to keep these separate because a lot of the times a One Bar build without Oakensoul can be stronger than one with. But I generally have not found a single person with a proper One Bar build that didn't use Oakensoul. The only people who played One Bar builds without Oakensoul were the Skyrim Endies who ran around with random mix of gear and not a single full 5-piece bonus, and who tend to do tanky DPS. So if you look at 1 bar versus 2 bar DPS, the difference is 37,847 DPS, versus 46,730, so a 23.5% difference. But if you look at specifically Oakensoul versus non-Oakensoul, the difference is 41,160 DPS versus 44,485, so only an 8.2% difference. And the reason is, as I said before, that the non-Oakensoul average DPS includes all those 10k DPSs who don't even have a build in the first place. While if you're wearing Oakensoul, that means that you at the very least have some build. Beam versus non-beam DPS has the biggest gap, because it's 30,290 versus 53,205. So the average beamer is 75% stronger than a non-beamer, and that's a crazy difference, but not surprising. Beam is not only extremely easy to play, it's literally meta. You wanna use it in dungeons even if you are good at the game. The next comparison is between people who use the Hodor DPS share add-on versus people who don't. I expected this difference to be the highest, but in the end, the beam difference ended up taking that spot. So the difference here is 39,254 versus 55,946, so a 42.6% difference. So while the difference is smaller, technically the average Hodor user is still better than the average beamer, because the average beamer did 53,205 DPS. Nothing surprising about this statistic. It's natural that people who practice the rotation and use the necessary tools, like Hodor, have higher damage output than people who don't. And the last comparison is saying hi. And I actually counted any form of communication, not just hi. The average DPS who did not communicate at the beginning of the dungeon, or at any point basically, did 39,660 DPS, while an average player who did communicate did 49,555 DPS, which is roughly a 25% difference. I suppose that suggests people who are more social are also better at the game. Personally, while I think this is true, I don't think this alone would cause this big of a difference. I think the culprit is in the fact that ESO, unlike other MMOs, has this very specific demographic of Skyrim players who treat this game as if it was also a single player game. And they tend to keep their chat turned off, which means they couldn't have communicated. So, the conclusion? In my tanking guides, I'm always telling people to avoid Dungeon Finder like Fire, because you'll mostly encounter really bad players there, and it will only discourage you from tanking at all. I kind of proved myself wrong with this experiment, because the average DPS isn't that bad. If we have 2 average DDs, you'll have almost 90k group DPS, which is far from what's possible, but you'll still have a very smooth run. The issue is in the volatility. Yes, the average DPS is 43k, but it varies between as low as 8k to as high as 90k. And the thing is, if you're unlucky enough to get 2 of those 10k DDs, you're gonna spend the rest of your life chipping away at that dungeon. My advice? Don't be afraid of coming into random dungeons as a tank, but be ready to dip as soon as you see your DDs are trolling. It's obvious to see from the very first trashback. So personally, I like to stay if they're at the very least responding to advice in chat. And that's it for this video. Since all of my testing was on PC EU, I'm actually curious if you think the average DPS will be different on different servers. PC NA is something I might eventually test myself, but I will never test consoles. So I wonder what you think the situation is like over there. Thanks for watching and see you next time.